A huge thank you for the invitation to speak to such an incredible audience, and I hope you all had good journeys here and are ready to go. So I'm going to focus on learning initially, but I'm really going to spend this half hour thinking about how we learn as human beings, not just students. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about how we learn as adults, and particularly how we learn professionally as teachers. And I'm going to spell out what I think are some fundamental structural problems for why it's difficult to improve our practice as teachers, and take you through an approach which has evolved over 150 years and originated in Japan and is now spreading across the world, which I think has got some steps in it which can radically change that. And then to look at the impact, finally, on teacher community and teacher learning community that approach can happen and how it can bring about, and how that can also then fundamentally change the way that a system can work. And a system might be a national system, but a system could be a group of schools that are working together in a village or a small town. We have a baby who is learning to walk with some help, and I just wanted to reflect on learning, because that's one of the first things we learn to do. We're very motivated to do it. This baby is lucky because at the moment he's getting help to put one foot in front of the other without having to worry about falling. Sometimes we sit and we have a baby in between our knees and we help them to balance, but without having to worry about falling. Now, if that baby was not getting the help, he would still learn to walk because he really wants to walk, because his brothers and sisters can walk and get places quicker than he does. He will fall over a lot, so he's very motivated to walk. But with the help of, in this case, an adult, and sometimes probably his brothers and sisters, he can do the same thing. And as he grows up and learns to talk, and is helped to talk, he will be able to use talk with his brothers and sisters to help develop those ideas. And I believe that community, this is community, first of all. And I think you could equally have a picture of a teacher there being supported perhaps by some of their colleagues in a scaffolded situation where they're learning. They're able to take risks, do things they wouldn't normally do, because they're doing so with their colleagues and they've thought through what they're going to do, and they're not afraid of falling down together. And talk is going to be a theme. We do a lot of work at the Faculty of Education on dialogic learning, and I believe that dialogic learning demonstrably happens when we're adults as well as when we're children. Okay, so we learn by joining in with each other, and we learn by joining in with each other's thinking and ideas. And these children are using talk to scaffold their learning together and to solve problems, which together they can solve and they will learn something. But if the brightest of those children tried on their own, he or she probably wouldn't be able to solve. Howard Gardner, an American educationist, pointed this out to me about 25 years ago, that if we are to really understand how to help students learn, the complexity of what's going on in their heads, that's hard. We can't see it. We can't see the chemical reactions taking place in their brains. But somehow we have to place ourselves inside the heads of our students and try and understand as far as possible the sources and strengths of their conceptions. Now, I'll say later on that I think when they're working in groups like that, we can hear some of that happening, even though we can't see it. But I want to reflect on that as teachers, actually. Because I think, in fact, I'm absolutely convinced that the knowledge that we use professionally, our practice knowledge, sometimes called pedagogical content knowledge, our knowledge of our practice is fundamentally different from the knowledge used by other professions. Okay? Think of a time when you were teaching, or you were in a classroom where somebody was teaching, and it was going well. In other words, you felt that the students were learning. And if that lasted for, say, half an hour, What knowledge were you drawing on at different times in that half hour to make sure it kept going well? These are a list of things that I think we often do. Okay, we think about the curriculum, we draw on our knowledge of pedagogy, we draw on our knowledge of our students, and we draw on our knowledge of students in the past and what they were like. Subject knowledge we've talked about. But we also probably draw on our knowledge about how what we're doing today relates to life in the future. And if any of those was on your list, well done. Those things are interesting because they're the things we think of first. And in the main, they're things that are conscious. It's knowledge that we can retrieve. Okay? About 80% of what we do in the classroom is not conscious knowledge. It's quite often things we don't know we know. If you've ever watched yourselves teaching on a video, has anyone here watched themselves teaching on a video? A few people have. So did you have that experience? You go, do I do that? Did I say that? Why am I doing this? I didn't know I did this. And it goes beyond just expressions. A huge amount of what we know and do in the classroom is drawn from our first 3 years when we were learning to teach, and we were dealing with the complexity and the busyness of the classroom. And we hadn't time always to think about everything. We just had to do what instinctively felt right. And when that worked, we internalize it. When it doesn't work, then we wait another time and we try again. And then we internalize it if it works. But we don't have time to consciously think. And it enables teachers to juggle everything that's happening in a classroom and still focus consciously on the particular conversations they need to have with learners. So our tacit knowledge is deeply embedded within us in the first 3 years of our professional life, and the problem with it is it's invisible to us. We don't know we know it, and this is a problem for professional learning, because it's impossible to improve what you don't know you know, and it's very difficult to draw on. So I'm going to talk now about a process of professional learning that started in Japan about 150 years ago and moved west. So these are the barriers. We don't see our children's learning. Our practice knowledge is tacit and invisible. And in this country, and countries with an inspection system or a performance management system based on classroom observations and grading of teachers' lessons, that doesn't promote professional learning. You don't think, oh, the inspectors are coming in. I'll teach something that I'm not very confident in teaching, and they can help me get better. No. We think, oh, my performance management lesson, I'll teach something safe. And then, the person judging me and I will think up some objectives for me, but I'm not going to teach anything risky. So we have got a problem, a learning difficulty built into our system where we will not take risks. Isolated practice, as well, is an enemy of this. If we're always teaching on our own and then talking about it in the staff room at lunchtime, we've no idea whether we're talking about the same things. It was clear when I first started trying to adapt this Japanese model that we needed to build talk deeply into teacher talk, deeply into our practice to make learning visible and accountable. We had to make it build high levels of professional trust so people would feel safe to say, actually, I'd quite like to teach this lesson because I don't think I teach it very well, and feel supported. So creating safety to take risks, and it needed to be as motivating to teachers as learning to walk is for children. They needed to get up and try and fall time and time again and want to still do more. Harnessing dialogue, that's very, very important, okay? And so the model of Japanese lesson study that evolved in this country, first of all, is simple. It's based on the Japanese model, which is where you want to improve an aspect of your teaching or your curriculum, to improve the results, going back to the slides, but principally to improve the way children are learning and how you can help them learn as teachers. So you look at your curriculum, you decide on the areas where you want to focus. You might go on Google and look at approaches around the world for ideas of what might be worth trying. And if you're engaged in reflective practitioners, you'll be engaged in reading the literature and working with organisations like this. So you come up with an idea, and as a group of teachers, you plan a lesson together in one of your classes to try the new idea out with some specific additions. You then, which I'll talk about in a minute, but you then observe together, one of you teaches the lesson, and after the lesson, you talk to the students about what it was like for them, and you say, if we were teaching this with a similar class tomorrow, how could we make it better? And they'll tell you very good ideas. And then you sit down afterwards and you talk about what happened. And you do that 3 times. And the first time you find out more about your students than you ever knew. The second time you try again and you calibrate the lesson to the students you now know. And then the third time you test some hypotheses. And usually there's something that is going to change your practice and your colleagues' practice and are worth sharing with other teachers. And so the final part is presenting, in some way, this to your colleagues. And you can see in terms of dialogic exchange between teachers getting inside each other's heads, to quote Howard Gardner, there are lots of opportunities here for talk. I'll come back to case students in a second, but there's all the interviews, all the planning discussions, all the post-lesson discussions, and of course the discussions in the initial planning and the post-lessons meeting. The other thing that we do in this model, which is now being taken up globally actually, is to try and focus on, in order to be able to, you can't see everything in a classroom, but you can, if you focus in on some students, see them very clearly, and that helps you see what other children are doing. So what we do in this model is we also, while we're planning, we say, well, if the lesson is going well for Rupert, at this stage in the lesson, what do we think Rupert will be doing or saying or have done that will make us know it's okay to carry on and take the lesson forward? And the same for 2 other students. And we maybe make 3 of those predictions and agree them together, which takes some doing. And then what happens in the observed lesson, it's a lesson we all planned, we all own it, is that the teacher teaching will teach it and try to observe, and the other observers will just check what Rupert's doing at those particular points and just note down how similar or different, what was actually happening compared with what really happened. And that really focuses you on a post-lesson discussion that doesn't do what all mine did when I was a teacher, which is, well, Pete, I thought you started well. I thought the eye contact was good, and your pace was good. It was all about the teacher. What we do in those lessons is we talk about those case students. And what did you see? Oh, I saw him do this. Oh, I didn't see that. That's interesting. And you start to piece together a picture of not just Rupert's learning, but the other 2. And then you say, it wasn't just Rupert was doing that. There was a whole table doing that over there. And you reimagine the lesson and put it together like a jigsaw. And you start to solve the problems that you encountered. Interestingly, teachers will go into their teacher voices when they're doing this. So when you're trying to problem solve, sorry, Rupert, I keep picking on you, but I know your name. How could we have stopped Rupert getting that idea? How could we have introduced the task differently? And teacher will go, perhaps if we said da-da, 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 and they'll listen, and someone will say, well, what about da-da, 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 da-da? And then somebody else will say something similar. I won't keep doing it, don't worry. And then after maybe it's been around the group of teachers 2 or 3 times, somebody will go, they'll all go, that's it, that's the one. And that's the one they will then use in the lesson. And that's the way that actually solved the problem. They didn't discuss why it would solve the problem or even what the problem was. But by going into that, imagining together the lesson, imagining Rupert in the lesson and the other children and what would happen, that joint imagining released that tacit knowledge from those teachers. And that's a fundamentally different feature of lesson study from other forms of professional development, from coaching, from peer coaching. And if you listen to teachers discussing lessons and you do analyses of their discourse, which we've been doing now at Cambridge for some years, you'll find that the times when they are most taking on new ideas and letting go of old ideas is when they're hypothesizing about what might have happened or what might happen next time, or how we could stop it. But equally, it's also when they're going into their teacher voices and drawing on their tacit knowledge. So that's a fundamentally different feature of the teacher learning that you get in lesson study, and I think it's almost unique. So those were the most associated with teacher learning. The post-lesson discussion, you can see a really blurry picture here. So this is teachers afterwards talking, and they're animated and they're excited, and they're keen to learn more about the gaps that they've now got in their knowledge. And Neil Mercer's work at Cambridge has focused a lot on student and now teacher interthinking. What those teachers are doing is building a mental map of what's happening or what should have happened and what could happen next time. And through that, they're problem-solving together ways forward. He calls it an intermental zone. And we're going to need a bit of sound. And here are some teachers, this will take about 30 seconds, after a maths lesson. And I've just used this as an example of the kind of things that you can see for the first time in a lesson study when some teachers are realizing that the children were using the word, some children in the class are using the word double to mean, which means times two, to mean something very different.
One thing, though, that is a surprise. You know how we said he'll double and double again at the start because he loves doubling? I realised he's using the word double instead of multiply. Wow. He thinks double is multiply. So, for instance, he says, I doubled 2 by 3 to get 6.
Oh, that's so interesting.
So, a very simple thing that solved a big problem in that class, and then they discovered it wasn't just that class. There were children across the school who were using double as a synonym for multiply. And it worked in that case, but as they got older and they then were still using double to mean multiply, it led to all sorts of problems. So lesson study gives you 3 special powers, which are X-ray eyes. You see your children much more clearly. You understand their learning much more clearly. It creates a shared endeavour between the teachers to help that team of teachers help those children learn. And you don't need technology. You can do lesson study anywhere. The Japanese government is supporting lesson study around the world, but it builds strong teacher learning communities. These teachers are helping their children learn, but they're also doing so because they're developing a shared passion together to help those children to learn. They're sharing their successes, but also the setbacks, and they care about helping those children to learn. So you see lesson study take root in schools. And the teachers use a kind of learning that we're calling meaning-oriented learning, which is solving problems about how the children are learning by studying that learning. And it's a very powerful, deep mode of teacher learning, and you found it in great abundance in lesson study. We did a project in London about 4 years ago, and it was a 2-year project, and it involved 96 schools. And after the 2 years, 60 schools, the project ended, and 60 schools said, but we want to carry on. So they carried on in 3 different parts of London on their own, just using each other's schools. And we went and met with them whenever they met, and they met every term. And they did lesson studies, and then they met again each term and shared their lesson studies. But one of the things we asked them to do was just to predict what would happen if you didn't do the lesson study, and then do an assessment afterwards. And they were focusing mainly on mathematics. The interesting thing is that over 252 lessons where they were trying out ideas, research lessons, you could see that the children who were predicted to still be struggling by the end of the research lesson reduced by 18%. And the children who were meeting expectations increased by 18%, and who were exceeding expectations also increased by 18%. And that's fairly typical of the difference that doing lesson study is what helps teachers to report. And teachers share their lesson studies, sometimes by writing it up or doing a presentation, but often, as in this case in Hong Kong, through a public lesson where a teacher teaches the lesson with the children, and then they all have a big discussion together. But in terms of communities, what I've seen it do is turn good teachers to outstanding teachers, outstanding teachers into expert coaches who work across schools, and that creates a self-sustaining system. In Japan, the lesson studies that all schools in Japan do all the time are gathered up by local universities and by local authorities, and they are turned into meta-studies. And those meta-studies inform the 5-year cycle of curriculum renewal in Japan, and then as the curriculum is renewed, not just based on a political idea or a politician's pet love, but on empirical evidence coming from classrooms, it feeds down into the way the new curriculum works. And so you get this wonderful cycle of, classroom-informed national curriculum policy working in Japan. And you can build networks of schools using lesson studies to learn with, from, and behalf of each other. And the one thing I know is that teachers, they're very, very willing to go the extra mile because this gives them such reward themselves, and they know that their own practice improves. So there's some references which will sent to you on the slide, and I'm going to say at this point, thank you.